bro shit. It's time for some gay bro shit. Get into it, gay bro shit. Let's fuck with it, gay bro shit.
Hey, hi, hello, bros and hoes and theys and thems and everybody else, whoever you are. This is Gay Bro Shit, a podcast for people who don't mind sticking needles into their butt once a week or so, as directed by a licensed medical provider. And you can call me Brogetful because I forgot to come up with a pun today. But my name is Dan, I'm your host, and today we are talking about testosterone. What it is, what it does, and what it doesn't do, and how we might be able to change our levels to optimize our health and performance. But first, a check-in. First things first. This is episode 6 now, and I'm delighted to keep seeing new international listeners. We got somebody listening in Austria, we got people in the UK, someone in India. So that's really cool and unexpected. Thanks to all of y'all for tuning in. Also, just wanted to give a little bit of a general check-in. I mentioned previously that I was in a bulking phase, and it's about 5 weeks in now, and I'm up 10 pounds. So I'm adding about 2 pounds or almost a kilo every week. And I'm eating an average of 3,400 to 3,600 calories a day. And at first I thought this was going to be really hard, and I was not sure I was going to be able to eat that much because it is genuinely a lot of food. But once I sort of gave in and gave myself permission, my body was like, fuck yeah, this is awesome. Just keep feeding us. And some days I can pretty much keep eating until I've consumed well over that number. And then there's other days I'm not as hungry and I just kind of have to ride with it. But it is interesting because I track my weight daily. So I can look back and see a chart of how it fluctuates. And there's definitely a pattern where it goes up a lot during the week and then drops back down during the weekend when I'm working. And my job is very physical, so I expend a lot of energy at work. So I probably should eat even more on the days that I'm working, but I find it harder to do that for a variety of reasons. And the other interesting thing is typically you would expect to see some fat increase when you bulk. Most typically you're going to add mass in a 1-to-1 ratio, so about 1 pound of fat for every pound of muscle. But my waist circumference hasn't changed at all. So I probably haven't added 5 pounds of fat. So that's really interesting. And a big reason I'm able to do that is probably because of the topic of today's episode. So before we get into any conversation about hormones, I need to clarify something. And as I talk about this, I'm going to talk about male and female, men and women, and I need to say up front that I'm using these terms to refer to biological sex and not gender. Sex and gender are not the same thing. And if you don't understand that, all I'm going to say is go listen to some trans or non-binary people explain the difference. But in short, gender is how you feel on the inside and how you present, and sex is what your body looks like and how it functions. Reproductively, there are more than 2 biological sexes, as there are more than 2 genders, but this episode is going to ignore a lot of that complexity. I also need to clarify that I am not licensed to practice medicine, and this is not medical advice. If you're looking to take testosterone, either for replacement as you age, or for gender-affirming care, or for performance or aesthetic reasons, you need to work with a provider and within the laws of your location. In the US, testosterone is legal with prescription, and in other places, you may not need a prescription at all, or it might also be banned entirely. But I can talk about my personal experiences and the experiences of others and what the research shows. So let's get into it. First of all, what is this substance? Testosterone is a naturally occurring hormone found in the body. Both men and women have it, and people of all genders and sexes. Hormones are signaling molecules that essentially get cells to act in a specific way based on their chemical structure. And they are produced by the adrenal glands and by the sex organs. And the three main sex hormones are testosterone, which is our main character today. And this is the chemical that is responsible for male sex characteristics, such as, well, the growth of testicles, but also things like face and body hair and having a deeper voice. Then there's also estrogen, which is the chemical that is primarily responsible for female sex characteristics. In the body, this actually takes the form of estradiol. There's also progesterone, and this one's a little bit harder to define because its primary role is in females. It basically enables pregnancy and it also enables breastfeeding. But in males, it's also critical for sperm production and synthesizing testosterone, among other things. And so progesterone is the main medicine in most birth control medication. So while we think of testosterone as the male hormone and estrogen as the female hormone, everybody has all three hormones, but in different levels, and they need to be balanced for optimal functioning. But the balance will be different for different people. In men, we want to think of estrogen as being universally bad because high estrogen levels make you retain water, it can make you store more fat, be less emotionally regulated, and of course it can cause the dreaded and feared gynecomastia, which is the growth of breast tissue in men. So we would think this is something that we would want to minimize as much as possible, but that's actually a mistake because it has essential functions for men as well. For example, while testosterone levels are the main factor in sex drive, testosterone only works to do that if estrogen is also present. So something that happens when people take estrogen blockers is that their sex drive can collapse. So if your testosterone level rises, your estrogen level will also need to rise to balance it out to a point. And your body converts testosterone to estrogen via the process of aromatization, and about 0.3% of testosterone is converted this way. Now, some people aromatize at different rates, so it could be higher, it could be lower, of course. And another testosterone derivative we might be interested in knowing about is dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. And this is the hormone responsible for the growth of facial and body hair, but it's also what causes male pattern baldness. So medications to prevent hair loss work by blocking DHT. About 5% to 7% of testosterone is converted to DHT. So that is why higher testosterone levels lead to less hair on your head and more hair on the rest of your body. Now, we also know that these same sex hormones are found in most vertebrate species, so we are definitely not unique in any way. So how do we measure hormones? Well, we do a blood test, and it's best to do this early in the day because that's when your natural levels peak, usually between 4 a.m. and 9 a.m., wherever you are, which incidentally is also why we get morning wood. And in the US, we measure levels in nanograms per deciliter, but in other parts of the world, they often use milligrams per deciliter. So basically take the numbers I'm about to give you and divide them by 100 for that number. So for most men under the age of 40, their testosterone level will usually fall between 264 and 916 nanograms per deciliter. And the higher the number, the higher the level. The average level in American men and also in European men is about 630, but that range itself may not be super useful. So let's look closer at the percentiles. So the bottom fifth percentile, meaning the out of 100 people, the 5 people with the lowest testosterone would be 303 and below. And the 95th percentile, meaning the 5 people who have the most, would be 852 or above. So 90% of men are between this range. And it does also decline with age. So the median level declines by about 100 points between the ages of 20 and 60. And after this, it definitely starts to go down a bit faster. So converting this to a milligram per deciliter reading, we would get a 90% range of 3.03 to 8.52 with a mean level of 6.3. See, I am an American who, in fact, loves the metric system, even if, as I discussed before, I cannot visualize centimeters. Now, for women, the range is between 13 and 56 nanograms per deciliter with a mean testosterone level of 32.6. So basically about 1/20th of what it is in men. So we would think that women would be way less muscular than men. However, this is not the case, as women can develop a pretty good amount of muscle, so testosterone is definitely not the only thing responsible for muscle mass. All right, now let's get into some history. Everybody loves history, especially you. That's why you're listening. The hormone was discovered formally in 1935. But going back throughout history, there are legends that would indicate some knowledge of its existence, even if theoretical. One thing we definitely know or knew was that the testicles were important for the development of male sex characteristics and fertility. And we knew this because we knew what happened when we castrated people, i.e., we removed their balls. And there's evidence for that practice going back at least 6,000 years. So we would assume that some knowledge of that has gone back for at least that long. Some knowledge of the testicles having an impact on male sex characteristics. Because we knew that the balls were the source of male virility, it is alleged that some cultures consumed testicles from bulls as a performance booster. It is said that the Huns of Central Asia ate them before going into battle, and the ancient Greeks were said to have eaten them before competing in the Olympics. But of course, we don't actually know if this is true or not, or just the stuff of legend. And the thing about eating hormones and animal parts is that they get broken down by your stomach and liver in a way that very little of any of what you consume would actually enter your bloodstream. Probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 to 1%. In the late 1800s, we began to do, I say we, I wasn't fucking there. Anyway, somebody that I am possibly distantly related to began to do some experiments to try and figure out what this hormone actually was. A German scientist by the name of Berthold experimented with transplanting testicles in birds. And then a bit later, a Harvard professor and scientist named Charles Edward Brown Sigard extracted something. I hope I said his name right, but he's dead. I don't think he cares. Anyway, this guy, Charles, extracted something from dog and guinea pig testicles and tried injecting it into himself, only to report feeling more vigorous. But these effects faded quickly, so it's likely it might have just been the thrill of the experiment rather than the actual substance of the injection. In the 1920s, a University of Chicago professor named Fred Cook, no relation to the heinous billionaire brothers, had a student extract 20 milligrams of the substance from 40 pounds of bull testicles that they just happened to have access to because at the time the animal stockyards were in Chicago and that's where they did all of the slaughtering for the US. So they had access to bull testicles and they isolated a substance. And when they injected it into animals that had been castrated, it seemed to remasculize the animals. So sex characteristics that had disappeared then came back. Then in the 1930s, a few European pharmaceutical companies funded research into this substance. And in 1935, a group in the Netherlands working for the Organon Company was the first to isolate and identify the compound and give it the name it has today. The name testosterone is a combination of test for testes and sterol because of the type of chemical it was. That same year, the chemical structure of the hormone was identified, and it was also quickly synthesized. And that synthesization and also the identification earned a Nobel Prize in chemistry for the two main scientists. That would be Adolf Butenandt. I'm not good at these names. I'm really sorry. Adolf Butenandt and Leopold Ruzicka. Sure. And after that, they, after they discovered it and we knew how to make it, we were kind of off to the races in studying the effects of what it did, even though a pesky little World War got in the way. So by 1937, the hormone was now available as a drug, either as a pellet that could be placed under the skin or as testosterone propionate, which is an intermuscular injection. And that form of testosterone has a half-life of 48 hours, meaning within 2 days, it half of it had disappeared from the body. So you had to inject it every other day. Keeping in mind at the time we didn't have single-use syringes, so the risk of injecting every other day were much higher than they are now. So usage wasn't widespread, but it was allegedly used by Adolf Hitler during the war, and it was also used on experiments involving concentration camp prisoners, which obviously troubling to say the least. And then after the war, the Allies used the drug to treat malnourished concentration camp survivors. And it did actually work for that. Then in the 1950s, we got two new forms of testosterone, cypionate and enanthate. And these have much longer half-lives, usually about, 7 to 10 days. So people only need to inject them every week or every 2 weeks in some cases. And we also around this time got the first single-use syringes, which made injecting much safer and easier to do. So it became potentially more accessible. And apparently JFK used the drug during his presidency. At the same time, we also developed synthetic versions, which became the variety of anabolic steroids we have today that are used for performance and aesthetic reasons. And we also around this time got the first use of sex hormones, both estrogen and testosterone, as hormone replacement therapy for gender-affirming care. I could find a case as early as the 60s. So through the late 20th century, we saw usage slowly grow until it really started to blow up rapidly in the 90s and early 2000s. Between 2001 and 2011, usage rates tripled, and by 2020, there were over 3 million people with prescriptions in the United States. Early on, testosterone was primarily used to treat people with hypogonadism, meaning these are people who did not produce enough testosterone naturally, but over time usage has shifted, and now in addition to its role as gender-affirming care and its clandestine use as a sports performance enhancer, it's marketed as an anti-aging treatment for people who don't fall below the clinical range. And if you're listening to this, you too have probably wondered if you might benefit from using testosterone. So aside from getting blood tests, which is the only way to know for sure, what are some symptoms we should look out for that might indicate that we need to hop on some vitamin T? So my dog is entering the room. That's her coming down this. Hi. No, Dad's busy. Yeah, not right now. Okay, well, anyway, let's read this list of symptoms and excuse the dog noises in the background. All right, so we have reduced sex drive. We have erectile dysfunction, a loss of armpit and pubic hair, shrinking testicles, hot flashes, low or zero sperm count, depressed mood, difficulties with concentration and memory, increased body fat, enlarged male breast tissue, otherwise known as gynecomastia. I'm not good at pronouncing things sometimes. I have to record shit all the time. Decreases in muscle strength and mass, and decreases in endurance. The thing about these symptoms is while some of them, like shrinking testicles and hot flashes, are really specific, a lot of them are pretty general and could be signs of something else. For example, just having depression or other mental health issues might lead to a lot of these symptoms. So it's really hard to parse out if it's low testosterone specifically. So the only way to know for sure is to get tested, which leads me to my experience. So about a year ago, I was noticing that I had a lot of these issues and I had very little energy or drive. And I was also gaining body fat in a way that didn't make sense for the amount of food that I was eating, because I really wasn't eating much at the time. And this is maybe a little embarrassing, but I was watching the movie Bros, and there is a scene where one of the main characters, Aaron, is caught by the other one named Bobby injecting in the bathroom at their vacation house, which is supposed to be in Provincetown, even though it's clearly not. That's a whole other thing. Anyway, there's this brief conversation where Aaron says, "No, it's not steroids. It's just testosterone and all my friends are on it." And I'm paraphrasing here. I don't have the script in front of me, but that scene, seeing that, definitely got me curious, and in a way that probably wasn't intended by the filmmakers, I'm sure. So I decided to get tested. And I went through one of the many online providers and I got my results back. And sure enough, I was on the lower end of the scale at about 400 nanograms per deciliter. Now, this is not clinically low, but I still kind of felt like I was lower than I had been in the past. And since I'd never gotten tested before, I don't have any way of knowing this compared to what would have been a baseline earlier in my life. But this is one of my big points when we talk about TRT or testosterone replacement therapy, is that even if your number isn't low clinically, it might be low for you personally. And so you might have to advocate for yourself hard. And I've heard stories of a lot of other men who've had to go through multiple providers before they could get prescribed because their numbers weren't low enough, only to then have immediate relief of their symptoms when they were finally put on it. And I've also heard stories of people whose numbers were like really, really low and still not getting prescribed it because providers are so reluctant to prescribe a controlled substance, essentially. And that was my experience. My provider was really reluctant to put me on testosterone outright for a few different reasons. And they were being conservative, and I can totally respect that. So we started using a medication called clomiphene, also known as Clomid, which acts to keep more of your testosterone in circulation. So I was put on this medication, and then 3 months later, I was retested, and my testosterone levels had doubled. So they were above 800 now, and they were closer to the top of the normal range. But I didn't really feel any better. I pretty much had all of the same symptoms still. And independently, I was also on another medication at the time for mental health reasons that also causes many of the same side effects as low testosterone, including weight gain, low energy, etc. And I also just recently found out that that medication itself can cause your testosterone to be lower. So it's a good probability that that medication was more of the culprit. But I worked with my other provider to get off that medication. So when I did start to feel better, but definitely not entirely. So I decided then that Clomid wasn't really doing the job because I was still tired and unmotivated, and I still felt fat, although that word is definitely loaded, but I felt fat for me. So I decided to bring in the big guns and try actual testosterone. And guess what? My energy and my drive and my ambition all came back, and I started to lose fat and put on muscle again. And most critically for me, I felt like I was alive again and ready to make things happen for myself. And I'm making this podcast now because I was able to get my drive back. Like, I'm getting shit done, and it feels genuinely good. And this is, again, not medical advice, just my own experiences. My testosterone was not low by the medical definition, but it turns out it was low for me, and I'm happiest and function best when it's at the top of the natural range or even a little above it, as we'll find out. All right, story time over for now. So, what are the ways that people can take testosterone? Firstly, we have pills, particularly a form of testosterone called testosterone undecanate. And as I previously mentioned when we talk about eating testicles, most of this gets metabolized by the liver, and so it doesn't end up in your bloodstream. It's also very toxic to the liver, and since liver damage is irreversible, usually people only get prescribed an oral version of testosterone for the short term. But I'm sure the pharmaceutical companies, in their infinite omnipotence and just true desire to do right by humanity, are working on better versions, and we'll probably get those sooner or later. We also have implants or pellets. These are little sort of nodules that get injected under your skin where they slowly release medication. And these get replaced every 3 to 6 months. But in practice, these are suboptimal because they do not last as long as they are designed to. So we can sort of crash in between every time you get them put in. They can also get infected, or they can just pop out of the skin. And then we have gels that get spread on the skin. Usually you spread them on your arms, your legs, but these have to be applied daily, often multiple times per day. I've heard 2 or 3 times a day. And women and children can accidentally come into contact with them. So you have to be really careful about wearing clothing, washing your hands, and not letting anybody touch you in these places after it's been applied. So only about 10% of what is applied in terms of the dosage gets absorbed into the skin. So it's just not a very efficient delivery method. There's also a nasal gel that you rub around the inside of your nasal cavities, but this needs to be administered multiple times a day, and it can also irritate your nasal tissues. We also have troches or gels that go under the tongue or inside the cheeks, and this is supposed to absorb more easily into the bloodstream than through ingestion, but up to 70% of it gets sort of metabolized by your liver right away. So again, not very efficient if you're only getting about 30% of what you take in. And then finally, we have the preferred method, which is injections. Sometimes people inject subcutaneously, which means into fat tissue. And this is how most people inject insulin, but it's also done at a very shallow angle and using a really small needle. But more usually you would inject intermuscularly, meaning you take a longer needle and inject straight down into the belly of a muscle, where the muscle sort of acts as a reservoir and slowly releases the hormones into your bloodstream. And if you've ever had a vaccine, then you've had an intermuscular injection. So you kind of know what that experience would be like. And you also know that sometimes you get pain in that area for a few days after the injection, which is definitely something that can happen with injecting testosterone. And what you definitely don't want to do is inject directly into a blood vessel, because then it floods your body all at once. So when you inject into the muscles, you need to do it in an area where there's not a lot of blood vessels. Usually this is the deltoid or the shoulders. This is where most people get vaccines. There's also a spot on the quads just outside of the knees, and most popularly the glutes or your butt. And that's why I make jokes about shooting needles into your butt. So injections obviously come with risks, most notably the risk of getting infection at the injection site. So you need to be careful when prepping the site and when prepping your medication, and also using good technique. And I've heard of horror stories of people developing giant abscesses where they get an infection and then they have to go get this drained. And so don't take this shit lightly, right? Okay, so now suppose we're not quite ready to jump into sticking needles in your butt. There are some things you can do to raise your testosterone levels naturally, but they only go so far. So according to an article in Healthline that I found, here is what they suggest. Number 1, they suggest exercise, particularly strength training. In one study, weight training was shown to boost testosterone blood levels sharply, but only temporarily, meaning for just a few hours. For longer term, some studies have shown that exercise boosts your overall base levels, but some other studies found that it didn't. So a little bit contradictory there. Number 2 is eating enough food, particularly protein and fats. We also know that dieting, particularly low-fat diets, really tank your testosterone levels. And when we test natural bodybuilders in a cutting phase, their testosterone levels are usually way below they are at their baselines. And the good news is they come back, but they're usually really low toward the end of the cut. Next thing they suggest is to minimize stress. And that is because the stress hormone cortisol sharply reduces your testosterone levels. And raising testosterone levels lower cortisol. So they work like a seesaw. Of course, as somebody with an anxiety disorder, it's definitely not effective to be like, hey, you stop being so anxious and stressed. It's bad for your testosterone. Of course, that's not going to fucking work, right? Another thing they suggest is you take vitamin D, and that is because some studies have shown that taking a vitamin D supplement increases testosterone levels and improves erectile dysfunction. However, other studies have not found this link, so maybe or maybe not. But other than vitamin D, there's no actual evidence that any other supplements work. So anything sold as a legal tea booster is probably just some random herbs that don't do anything to raise your testosterone levels. Some people say ashwagandha, some people say fenugreek, but not according to any of the scientific literatures. They don't do shit. All right, number 5, improve your sleep. A small 2011 study found that sleeping only 5 hours per night was linked to a 10 to 15% reduction in testosterone levels. And another study involving older men found that an increased sleep duration of up to 9.9 hours was associated with increased testosterone levels. Number 6, reduce alcohol intake. So testosterone levels may drop as quickly as 30 minutes after you drink alcohol. Heavy alcohol use can lead to reduced testicular function and testicular atrophy. But there also seems to be a correlation with higher testosterone levels and higher alcohol consumption, meaning people with a higher base level are more likely to consume an excessive quantity of alcohol. And that certainly bears out in my experience playing rugby, where excessive drinking is very common. And I'm sure it's like that on other sports teams as well. So those are some things you can do naturally. Good luck if you pursue those things. Anyway, shifting back to TRT, that's testosterone replacement therapy. Assuming we are using injections, most people are going to be injecting weekly, but some people will inject more or less often. In my experience, and a lot of other people as well, injecting twice a week makes it easier to keep levels stable, but it also means twice as much hassle. And on the low end, you might use 100 milligrams per week of testosterone, cypionate, or enanthate. And on the higher end, you might inject up to 200. My dog just came down the stairs again into the room. So she's back. She's back. Now, of course, you could use more than 200 milligrams, but anything above 200 a week, and you start getting into the territory of testosterone as an anabolic steroid. And testosterone is one of the most commonly used anabolic steroids because it's also the best studied and debatably the safest. So anything above 300 milligrams per week would be considered steroid abuse. But if you hop on the internet, you'll see people recommending 500 or 600 per week as a starting steroid cycle. And that's because 600 is the maximum dose that we've studied that was found to be safe. We've not studied any doses above that, so we really don't know that anything above that would be safe. And of course, there are some people who take more. I've heard of some very seasoned users taking over 2,000 milligrams, maybe up to 3,000 milligrams, which is basically 20 times what the starting TRT dose is. And I watched a video from a bodybuilder on YouTube who did this. And the wildest thing was he said, I just took testosterone and nothing else. And then he said, but I did have to take this all these other drugs, and there was this laundry list of things that came up on the screen. It took like about 2 minutes to scroll through all of them, and there must have been like 30 other things on that list. So it was really wild for him to be like, oh yeah, I'm just on testosterone, but here's this other list of medications and supplements that you would need to take to do this safely. And that's wild for any number of reasons. Anyway, I'm planning to do another episode at least specifically on steroids. So we're going to wait to dive into that, because this episode is really meant to talk about testosterone as a medication. So on that note, let's talk about what you're probably really here for, and that is what testosterone does aesthetically. In my own experience, does testosterone help reduce body fat and build muscle? Yes. But I combined it with an aggressive increase in workout intensity and a renewed focus on nutrition. So I can't personally say what effect it had in isolation, because there was multiple variables at play. But most men who have gone on TRT have experienced the same thing, and not everyone, but most. In 2014, a meta-review of a bunch of different studies where men with low testosterone were given the drug in various forms, including gels, patches, and injectables, and ranging from as short as for 3 months to as long as 16 years. They found that in every single study, men had a reduction in waist circumference, meaning they lost fat mass, and they also gained lean mass. Now, these are averages, of course, and individual participants may not experience any weight loss or muscle gains at all, but on average, people do. In one of the studies reviewed, they specifically gave testosterone to men who were classified as obese, and for reasons we won't get into today, that is it's a very loaded term, and so it has a specific definition, which is problematic, but we'll just say for the purposes of this, they gave testosterone to men who were classified as obese, meaning their BMI was above, I believe, 2030. I don't remember what that is. I don't really care about BMI. Anyway, they gave testosterone to these men for a period of 6 years. And I need to point out that because these men were already carrying more fat tissue, don't assume that these numbers that I'm about to give would translate to somebody who's already leaner. So in group 1 of the study, which had the smallest beginning weight, the average weight dropped by 12.55 kilograms over the 6 years, which is about 27.5 pounds. The middle group lost 20.67 kilos, or about 45.5 pounds, and the biggest group lost 27.15 kilos, or almost 60 pounds. And what was interesting was that if you view like the chart that shows the weight loss year by year, it's pretty linear. So you would maybe expect a big drop off at first and then a leveling off as the years went by, but that's not what happened. So it seems like to see the full benefits of TRT in terms of fat loss, you need to continue using it. And these were the mean numbers. So there were definitely people who lost more weight and people who lost less weight. So that was a study on just a normal TRT dose. We might then wonder, well, what happens if I take a lot more? Fortunately, there's a really well-known study that might give us some insight into what we can expect would happen at certain dosages. And this study was done in 2001 by Bazin and colleagues on a group of healthy men with normal testosterone levels between the ages of 18 and 35 who had prior weightlifting experience and had not previously used any anabolics. For 20 weeks, they gave the participants one of 5 doses: 25 milligrams, 50 milligrams, 125 milligrams, 300 milligrams, and 600 milligrams. I previously mentioned that the standard TRT dose is 100 to 200, so 125 milligrams probably represents a standard TRT dosage. They also controlled for food intake and specifically instructed the participants not to engage in any moderate or intense activity or strength training so that they could look at just the effects of the testosterone doses independently of any other variables. Now, a big caveat here is that the food intake was self-reported. And if you listen to episode 2, you'll know that that's kind of a red flag because people are very bad at reporting their own food. So it's definitely potentially a source of error for this study. But let's just assume that they did, okay? or let's just assume that everybody had the same degree of error, so we can kind of rule that out. So for the men who received 25 milligrams a week, they actually, on average, lost 1 kilo of muscle and gained about 3 kilograms of fat mass. And this is probably because in the study, they first suppressed testosterone levels completely. So these men were receiving less testosterone than the body naturally produces, which is about 30 to 40 milligrams per week. The group that received 50 milligrams a week did a little better. On average, they gained about a half a kilo of muscle, or a little more than a pound, and they also gained an average of 3.5 kilos of fat, probably for the same reasons as the first group, in that the level of replacement wasn't sufficient. So the third group received 125 milligrams, which is right around the average TRT dose. And this is where things get more saucy. So while this group didn't lose any fat mass, they also didn't gain any. But what they did gain was 3.4 kilos of muscle mass. So that's about 7.5 pounds of muscle in 5 months without working out. The fourth group that was put on the 300 milligrams a week, and they, on average, lost about a half a kilo of fat, which is really not that impressive, frankly. Half a kilo is about a pound. Really not anything you would ever notice on the body. But they did add an average of 5.2 kilos or 11.5 pounds of muscle. Again, in 5 months, not working out. And finally, the 600 milligram group lost an average of 1 kilo of fat, which is still not very impressive, but they gained a whopping 7.9 kilos of muscle, or a bit more than 17 pounds, just from testosterone. And I think there was somebody in the study who gained closer to 40 pounds of muscle in just that time period, but that person was clearly an outlier. So this study is why people on the internet like to suggest 600 milligrams as the starting steroid cycle. But when comparing the fourth and fifth groups, you start to see that the relationship between dose and muscle mass gain is not directly linear. So you would expect that the people receiving 600 milligrams a week would build twice as much muscle as those receiving 300, but they only gained 46% more by taking twice as much drugs. And above this dose, the results seem to really taper off, so that if you see a graph, it looks more like a curve, with it leveling off fairly quickly once you get into the higher doses. So it's tempting to take more, but it just isn't effective and probably not worth the risk of negative side effects. In another great article by James Krieger from Weightology, he ran a regression on, I think there was like 15 or 20 studies of testosterone and dose dependency. And he found that once you increase your testosterone level more than 1,000 over baseline, you don't build any additional muscle. I've referenced James Krieger's work before, so I guess that makes him our first official friend of the pod. Hey, James. Good work. Hit me up, bro. So if you start with a base level of 400, in my case, once I reach 1400, then I'm not going to see any additional mass gains if I go beyond this. For example, incidentally, my most recent blood test on 200 milligrams of test a week was 1450. So I was able to hit that on just a high TRT dose. Now, I probably should take my dose down a little bit so I'm not above the natural range. But on the other hand, all of my other blood work and health stats are good. So I might as well just enjoy the extra bump in mass gains for a while. And in that same study, the average blood level of the men on 300 milligrams raised by 700 points, whereas mine went by over 1,000 on a third lower dose. And the real reason for this is probably because I continue to take a lower dose of Clomid, and that medication, again, keeps more testosterone circulating. So that might be a way of getting more bang for your buck. Again, work with your provider on that. I'm not a doctor. So in that study, the men did not work out at all. So we might wonder what happens when we incorporate exercise while taking testosterone. And fortunately, there was another good study done on that, also by the same guy, Bazin and colleagues, but it was actually done a bit earlier in 1996, so this study came first. And in this study, for 10 weeks, they randomly assigned 43 men to one of four groups. The first group was placebo with no training, unlucky dudes. Second group was testosterone with no training. Third group was placebo with training, and the fourth group was testosterone with training. So there were two variables, whether or not they received testosterone or a placebo, and whether or not they did strength training. So the first group didn't see much change. The first group that did placebo and no training, obviously. The second group that received 600 milligrams a week of testosterone for 10 weeks saw an increase of 3.2 kilos of lean mass. The third group that did strength training with the placebo saw an increase of 2 kilos over the 10 weeks. So not as good as the testosterone only group, but still fairly good. And then with the fourth group that received both the 600 milligrams of testosterone and did the strength training, you might assume they gained way more muscle mass, but on average, they gained 6.1 kilos over the 10 weeks. So while this is definitely the biggest of any group, when you add up groups 2 and 3, you get a total of 5.2 kilos. So you got 3.2 kilos from just testosterone and 2 kilos from just working out. That equals 5.2. Meanwhile, you got 6.1 kilos from the people who did both. So the synergistic effect is not as powerful as you might think. The group that did both only gained about 17% more than you would get by just combining the effects from group 2 and 3. So you can probably tell I'm actually fairly enthusiastic about the aesthetic results here, and I'm definitely biased, but I definitely don't think that you should be hopping on TRT if you already have healthy levels. And I also would strongly caution anyone who does start TRT to expect that results are going to be slow. But if you combine TRT with diet and exercise, then you can start seeing results pretty rapidly. And I also suggest trying to get your food and fitness and your sleep in order first, because it may just be that that's all you need to start feeling better naturally. And it's great to have a full toolkit, but not every tool is needed for every job. That's my dumb analogy of the day. If you want advice on how to optimize nutrition and exercise, please go back and listen to episode 2 where I explain how to do that. Now, of course, there are risks and downsides to testosterone therapy, and I absolutely have to go over those. A big one we have to cover is that testosterone affects your blood lipids, particularly your cholesterol. Especially in high doses, it tends to raise your LDL or bad cholesterol and lower your HDL, otherwise known as a good cholesterol. And that is something you definitely want to keep an eye on if you're using testosterone, so keep getting your cholesterol checked. Similarly, blood pressure is something you will want to keep an eye on as well, because it can elevate that as well. I tend to have borderline high blood pressure, so I bought an inexpensive cuff on the interwebs. And the good news is when I check my blood pressure in the morning, as long as I haven't had any caffeine yet, it's still well within the normal range. But once I have caffeine, it is all kinds of fucked up. Incidentally, I find that I am way more sensitive to caffeine now. Like, I used to have 3 big cups of coffee to get me going, and now I can have like 1 cup of black tea and I start to feel a little cracked out, at least in the morning. Later in the day, not so much. Back to side effects. There does seem to be no evidence of increased mortality in middle-aged men from testosterone. I'm guessing that means men under 60. There have been a few studies, however, that have found that in older men on TRT, they were 30% more likely to die of cardiovascular issues. So if you are an older man, I would say keeping an eye on your blood pressure and your lipids are even more critical. Again, if you're on TRT, you want to have your provider monitoring those things, and you may need to introduce some other medications to keep those things in check. On another potentially serious note, while there's no evidence that increasing your testosterone can cause you to develop cancer, if you already have prostate cancer cells, it fuels their growth. As we get older, we should be getting screened for that anyway. So I don't think this is something to be concerned about unless you have prostate cancer or have had it in the past or have a high PSA level. We also need to mention that when you start taking testosterone at most any dose, your body will eventually stop producing it on its own. So it can become very hard to get off testosterone because once you stop taking it, you'll experience a dramatic crash and a return to symptoms, often worse than before. And in that way, it can be very addictive. So you're committing to sticking a needle in your butt once or twice a week forever, which is small compared to what a type 1 diabetic has to do, but it can cause any number of complications when traveling because you have to travel with your medication and your needles and getting through security and possibly customs and then figuring out how to dispose of your needles safely. So that can become very complicated. And because testosterone is produced in the testicles, those will atrophy, meaning they will shrink. Some people will tell you that they shrink down to nothing, but most likely they're going to reduce by a third or as much as 50%. Another consequence is that your sperm production also decreases, so the likelihood of infertility increases. Now, my audience probably doesn't care much about that, but it is something to know if you are planning on having children from your own sperm. However, natural production will start up again in most cases, but your new baseline production will probably be lower than it was before starting the medication. And the good news is that your balls enlarge again. Yay. That being said, there are 2 medications that will help restart production fairly quickly, and you can even take them while you're on testosterone to keep your natural production going. One of these I already mentioned, and that's Clomid, and the other one is human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG, and I might have said that wrong, but who the fuck cares? So again, definitely something worth talking about your provider if you're concerned about shutting down your natural production, or if you're just concerned about your balls shrinking like me. Another possible side effect is mood swings, and this is something we will talk about more when we talk about steroids in general, but testosterone is a psychoactive substance, and especially in higher doses, can make you more emotional, impulsive, anxious, and even manic in some cases. So sticking to a replacement dose will mitigate that risk. Insomnia is also a possibility, and I notice whenever I try and cheat my dose upward, my sleep goes to absolute shit. And for me, not getting enough sleep is a one-way ticket on the high-speed train to crazy town. So I've got to be really careful about that. And you probably should be as well. We also already mentioned gynecomastia twice. That's male breast tissue development. Because the conversion of testosterone to estrogen, your body can get confused essentially. And this doesn't really happen on TRT doses that often, but if you're someone who aromatizes or converts at a really high rate, it can happen. And I do know of some bodybuilders who can't take more than 200 of testosterone without getting this. So if you experience any swelling or firmness around your nipples, or maybe some mild pain or discomfort there, then you probably need to lower your dose and possibly introduce another medication to limit the aromatization. And again, work with your provider about that. Testosterone might also make you hornier, which is not really a bad side effect in some cases, unless it leads you to having riskier sex. Oddly enough for me, I am maybe less horny now, but I don't really mind it because I still have a fairly normal sex drive. It's just that I'm less distracted by it, but that seems to be a bit atypical. And I don't really know why that is, but oh well. Finally, we have hair loss and acne. As I previously mentioned, some testosterone gets converted to DHT, which can lead to male pattern baldness, oily skin, and acne. And whether or not this will happen to you depends on how sensitive you are to DHT. So if you're already experiencing hair loss, testosterone might speed that up. If you're already prone to acne, testosterone might make it worse. And this is definitely a reason why you might want to wait until later in life. I'm already well past the point of no return with my scalp, so for me, it wasn't a big deal to risk that when I probably am not going to have hair for much longer anyway. And I've already started shaving it down, so it just really doesn't matter to me. Well, that was fun. Now let's talk about something way less fun. And we can't talk about testosterone in a vacuum because unfortunately the far right has become obsessed with the notion of testosterone being a key driver of manliness and also conservative thoughts and opinions. And I'm not interested in giving too much weight to this way of thinking, but I will give a summary. So according to the manosphere, that is men on the internet in the far right and in all of the other horrible places they inhabit. The theory is that men with more testosterone are more likely to be conservative, rugged, manly men, providers, shooters of guns, etc., and therefore liberals must have lower testosterone. And they're also obsessed with the notion that testosterone rates are declining and going as far as to theorize that there's some sort of insidious conspiracy afoot to make men softer, weaker, and more liberal by lowering their testosterone levels. There's two things that they point to as evidence, and the first one is unfortunately probably true. So according to a few well-done studies, testosterone rates in American males do seem to be declining over time. One study looked at rates over a 17-year period and found that in 1999 and 2000, the average level for the sample they had was 605. In 2003 and 2004, it had dropped a little to 567. And then in 2011 and 12, it had dropped further to 424. And then it goes back up a little to 431 in 2013 and 14, I believe. And then it goes up a little again to be it goes up again to be 451 in 2015 and 16. So definitely a decline there for sure. Now, the study theorized why that might be, and they list out the following reasons. Increased obesity and BMI, assay variations, diet / phytoestrogens, soy, otherwise known as soy, declined exercise and physical activity, fat percentage, which I don't really understand why that's different than increased obesity, but they listed it separately, marijuana use, and environmental toxins. So when I first encountered this study, my first thought was that our technology for taking the readings had maybe changed, but it turns out they used blood samples that they had collected and stored. So the tests were all done at the same time, and they used 3 different methods to get their reading. So it does generally look like mean testosterone levels are declining, but I'm also not going to sit here and say that that's a problem. But for the right, of course, it is a problem because to them, it means that men are getting weaker and more liberal. And they point to a second study that found a link between testosterone levels and political views. In this study, they had a sample of 136 men, and they gave them either a testosterone gel or a placebo gel, and asked them about their political views before and after they were given the gel. And the group that was weakly pro-democratic ended up being more likely to be weakly Republican after receiving the testosterone. I think I just gave a Freudian slip there and said pro-democratic, but let's be honest, the current Republican Party is anti-democratic at its core. So the slightly pro-liberal group ended up being slightly pro-conservative after receiving testosterone in the study. So the right latched onto this as proof that testosterone makes men conservative. But of course, they didn't really look at the details of the study, because the men in the study who reported being strongly liberal or strongly conservative didn't change at all. So it had no effect on the truly liberal in the group. So that kind of destroys the hypothesis that those two things are directly related. And Also, because of this study was done using self-reported political leanings, what more likely happened is that the men who reported leaning Democratic were actually lying to save face and had always leaned conservative, and it was after the testosterone that they were brave enough to just be honest about what they had always thought. So the right has become obsessed with this idea that things like soy in our food supply and microplastics and BPAs are being deliberately weaponized to lower men's testosterone levels. And they love to call their opponents low T or soy boys or any number of insults that conflate hormone levels with manliness. But the thing is, aside from this one very small study, there is no evidence that conservative men have higher levels of testosterone at all. Conservative men can have low testosterone just as often as liberal ones can. And if there was a direct correlation between testosterone levels and political leaning, I think we would have a lot more right-wing gay muscle boys than we do. There's also no actual evidence that men at the higher end of the normal range of testosterone are manlier than men at the lower end. Testosterone doesn't account for personality. It doesn't account for aggressiveness. And in the same vein, there's zero correlation between hormone levels and sexual identity. Sometimes the femmiest gays actually have really high testosterone and the butch jocks have low testosterone. It's completely random. And unless your testosterone actually is low, there's not a huge difference in strength or muscle mass or fat mass within that normal range. It's only when someone who is low uses TRT or when you get well above the normal range through supplementation that those things start to manifest. Now, I'm on TRT, so I clearly think it has benefits, but we can't ignore the toxic masculinity that goes into our perceptions about what it does or doesn't do for people. And the final point I want to make here, and I'm certainly not the first person to make it, is that when a cis man goes on TRT as he gets older in order to feel more like a man again, that is the exact same reason why a trans man would go on testosterone. TRT is gender-affirming care in the same way that hormones for trans and non-binary people are also gender-affirming care. And it's wild because when it's a cis man taking testosterone or a cis woman taking estrogen or progesterone, almost nobody seems to have a problem with it. But when it's a trans person, all of a sudden it's a natural. The double standard is really obvious and it's really fucking gross. So maybe just mind our own damn businesses when it comes to what other people do with their bodies, provided it doesn't have an impact on our own bodies. All right, that should do it for today. Don't be surprised if this subject gets brought back for part 2, part 3, etc. Possibly quite soon, depending on how things shake out. Because I'm going to continue to expand on these topics that have a huge capacity for intrigue and, of course, further developments as time elapses. All right, thanks for listening. If you are not already, be sure to follow us on Instagram and Threads at GayBroShit, where hopefully I'm going to actually start posting more regularly and talking about what I'm working on, maybe who I'm interviewing, and maybe eventually I'll post what I look like, although many of you already know, including the one guy I was talking to on Scruff, who lives in my town and has listened to all the episodes. You know who you are. And as per usual, I'm also going to ask that you do me a favor and leave a rating or review on whatever service you listen to us on. And also share the show with people you think might get value out of it, because that helps me grow. And I spent a lot of time writing and researching these episodes, and I can definitely see how it could become a full-time job, really. But first, I need to grow an audience in order to enable that. But I'll also probably just keep doing it regardless because I love doing it. I love doing the research. I love doing the writing, and I love getting lost in it. And I'm glad that it's resonating with some of you as well. So thanks again, and bye, bros.
That's why we're living it up at the butt sex disco, getting it on with all of my homos, loving it up at the butt sex disco, dancing around like I'm Yoko Ono, queering it up at the butt sex disco, spinning around to fend off my FOMO, getting it up at the butt sex disco, never going home.